Welcome back to Universal Insight. Please subscribe to my channel and press the bell icon for more updates. I bet you didn't know just how much a single policy could freeze America's busiest ports and send shockwaves through the entire economy. The port of Long Beach is paralyzed, cranes idle, ships stranded, and goods trapped in limbo. The ripple effects are felt far beyond the harbor, as businesses across the country brace for shortages and delays. What was once a bustling gateway for international trade now stands eerily still, a symbol of a nation caught in economic crossfire. The Liberation Day tariffs imposed by President Trump have thrown global supply chains into chaos. These sweeping tariffs were meant to protect American industries, but instead, they've triggered a domino effect: delays, rising costs, and uncertainty for importers and exporters alike. Now the Supreme Court has fast-tracked a case that could redefine presidential power. The eyes of the nation and the world are fixed on Washington, as justices prepare to weigh in on a decision with far-reaching consequences. At issue: can the president use the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, to impose sweeping tariffs without Congress? The answer could reshape the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches for generations. Small businesses and states argue this is a massive executive overreach, and lower courts have agreed. They warn that unchecked authority could set a dangerous precedent, undermining the very checks and balances that define American democracy. Yet the tariffs remain, upheld by legal stays as the nation waits for the Supreme Court's verdict. The uncertainty has left communities and companies in suspense, unsure of what the future holds. Lawsuits from companies like Learning Resources and VOS Selections highlight the crushing impact on American businesses. For many, these tariffs mean layoffs, lost contracts, and the threat of closure. The stakes: millions of livelihoods, the stability of global trade, and the very structure of American governance, hang in the balance. The world is watching, knowing that the outcome will shape not just America's future, but the global economy as well. The stage is set for a historic legal showdown, one that will echo through history no matter which way the gavel falls. It began in April 2025, an announcement that would send shockwaves through the global economy and ignite fierce debate across the United States. President Trump declared a national emergency over the ballooning trade deficit, framing it as a direct threat to America's economic security, and invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. Historically, IEEPA had been used for targeted sanctions against foreign adversaries, but now it was being stretched to serve as the legal foundation for sweeping tariffs on nearly 70% of all U.S. imports, a move without precedent. The new tariffs range from 10% on most goods, affecting everything from electronics to clothing and household items, to a staggering 50% on imports from countries like Brazil and India, targeting key trading partners and raising concerns about retaliation. Even close allies weren't spared, with 25% tariffs slapped on select Canadian and Mexican products, straining relationships across North America. The administration insisted that IEEPA's broad language gave them this authority, arguing that the trade deficit itself was an extraordinary threat to national security and economic stability. Critics, however, countered that Congress never intended IEEPA to be used for such sweeping trade policy, and pointed out that the Constitution explicitly grants Congress, not the President, the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. By invoking IEEPA in this way, the President bypassed the legislative branch entirely, concentrating immense power in the executive and raising alarms about the separation of powers. Opponents, from business owners fearing economic fallout to constitutional scholars worried about executive overreach, quickly mobilized to challenge the move in court. The central question now loomed large: does IEEPA truly authorize the president to unilaterally reshape U.S. trade policy on such a massive scale? The Supreme Court must now decide, and the outcome could redefine the balance of power in American government for years to come. The first significant legal blow to the president's tariff policy came from the U.S. Court of International Trade, a court tasked with overseeing the legality of trade actions and protecting the balance of power between branches of government. In a strongly worded decision, the court ruled that the president's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, to impose sweeping tariffs was unlawful and exceeded the authority granted by Congress. The judges emphasized that Congress never intended to hand the president a blank check to impose tariffs at will, especially not without clear limits or oversight. On appeal, the Federal Circuit Court upheld this landmark ruling, describing the tariffs as an unconstitutional power grab that undermined Congress's exclusive authority over trade policy. Both courts agreed the president had overstepped his legal boundaries. Yet, despite these rulings, legal stays kept the tariffs in place while the government appealed, leaving the situation unresolved. As a result, businesses across the country continue to pay millions in tariffs, and the Treasury Department still collects these funds, even as the legal limbo drags on with no clear end in sight. The lower court's rulings now give challengers a strong legal foundation as the case moves toward the Supreme Court, where the ultimate fate of the tariffs and the limits of presidential power will be decided. Meanwhile, the economic pain continues to ripple through American companies, small business owners, and families who all feel the impact of higher costs and ongoing uncertainty. The paradox remains: tariffs have been declared illegal by the courts, yet they are still being enforced at the nation's borders, creating confusion and frustration. Now, all eyes turn to the Supreme Court, which must finally resolve this contradiction and determine the true limits of presidential power over trade. Central to the lower court's rulings is the major questions doctrine. This principle says only Congress can authorize decisions of vast economic and political significance, like nationwide tariffs, through clear, explicit law. Challengers argue IEEPA's general emergency powers aren't enough to justify such sweeping action. The administration counters that IEEPA's language is broad, and the trade deficit is a true emergency. The Supreme Court must decide. Does IEEPA grant the president this power, or is it a major question only Congress can answer? The outcome will shape the balance of power between Congress and the presidency for years to come. The stakes couldn't be higher. The economic stakes are staggering. Up to $1 trillion in tariffs have already been collected. If the Supreme Court strikes down the tariffs, the government could be forced to refund this sum to importers. For businesses and consumers, the decision will mean either continued higher prices or long-awaited relief. A ruling for the administration would cement broad presidential power to impose tariffs by emergency decree. Future presidents could use this precedent to reshape economic policy without Congress. A ruling against the administration would reaffirm Congress's authority and limit executive overreach. The court's decision will define the limits of presidential power in the 21st century. The nation's economic future hangs in the balance. As the Supreme Court prepares for oral arguments, the country waits in suspense. The justices' questions will be closely watched for clues to the outcome. If the court upholds the tariffs, the new trade regime becomes permanent, forcing businesses to adapt. If the court strikes them down, it will trigger massive refunds and a major check on presidential power. The lower courts have called the tariffs illegal, but the duties are still collected and the ports remain gridlocked. The Supreme Court's verdict will shape the economy, the presidency, and the separation of powers for a generation. The final word is coming, and all of America is watching.